So the first thing I want to do as I begin this is to share with you an overview of what I will present tonight. First, I want to talk about how the Bible looks at the world that God created, and that includes the Bay Area. And then talk about Asian Americans, so that give you some information about the overall Asian American situation here, so that you can get a sense of how some kind of categories are things to hold on to as you talk to other people about your Asian American identity, and also for your children too. And then I want to talk about some of some challenges that I think, and there are many, but I want to pick on a couple. One is the issue of diversity in many different areas. In the Bay Area, there are so many different kinds of people that it makes it very confusing. So how do we as Christians who want to be able to live in this world with our values, live with that diversity? So that's another good topic. And then I'm going to conclude by talking about the PLJ solution, which is not really a big deal, but it's just something to make it sound like I have an answer. Because I don't really find it not practical. And then at the end, we'll have some time for discussion about your questions. Okay, so I'll try to go quickly, but not too fast, because I don't think that my presentation is really brand new. It's just to reinforce what you probably already know, but also to hopefully frame it so that as you think about your children and yourself as a parent, these categories might be useful for you to work with. Okay? Just to, all right, so again, interrupt me if you have any questions. Okay, so let me go briefly by talking about a biblical view of the world, and I'm not going to take out the Bible and share it with everyone. I know that not everyone here is a Christian. But what I do want to say is that there are some things that we Christians can do by understanding this perspective about the world that God created. And if we have this approach, then it helps us to live in this world better. Okay? So the first thing there are just a few categories I'll just go quickly through. One is that in the beginning, when we believe that God created this world, this creation that God created, He called good. Okay? So which means that the world is not an evil, terrible place. It's a good place. God created the garden so that we can enjoy and pick the fruit of the garden and nourish ourselves. We can garden it, we can raise our family. The intention for the world that God created for us is to make it a wonderful place to live where we can enjoy all the blessings of life and enjoy our relationship with God and with each other. So that's the initial purpose of creation. And that has not been wiped away. It's still there. Okay? The problem is, as you and I know, because of sin, human sin, what was good originally was marred, was effaced. It was like graffiti written all over it. Okay? And it does not mean that the world is completely terrible now and evil. But it just means that it is imperfect. There will always be imperfection. There will always be mistakes and problems in this world because of the fall, because of sin. Does that make sense? Right, so very, very simple and basic. But I want to make it clear that there's also a lot of problems in this world that make it very difficult to live in. And that's because of sin. But because as believers we believe that Jesus renews all humanity, He saves us, He saves us from our sin, and He also restores and renews creation, that this world that was originally good, that has been marred by sin, will eventually be restored to its original goodness. So our hope is that the world will become the place that God originally wanted it to be. So everywhere I go, I try to look for signs that God's goodness is still here. And I want to work for that. My role as a Christian is to help tell other people. In fact, that's the fourth one. The purpose of the church, our purpose is to bear witness, to tell the whole world that even though there's war, there's sickness, there's excessive competition, there's evil in this world, we see something bigger and better coming. And in Jesus, something good, even better, will eventually come. And our job is to point that to the whole world and point to that. The kingdom of God is what Jesus called us. Something even better is coming, and we are part of that. So as a believer, I really do believe that God wants this world and the life that we live to be an abundant, peaceful, joyful life. But we have to do this knowing that we still have to address I mean, that we still have to face the reality of sin. Okay, so the conclusion is that the world is not hopeless, even though it can be dangerous. Does that make sense? So whenever your children grow up in this society, we have to be careful, I say, to not jump and react and say, this is so terrible. And I just don't, I'm just so discouraged by how evil our world is and how difficult it is. I think the first thing that we believers as Christians hold on to is that the world is not hopeless, that there is a hope in Jesus Christ, there's a future, and you and I can share in it. Even though we may not share in it now, we will eventually. Okay, does that make sense? Any very, very basic, I just want to make sure that that's the framework. All right? Otherwise, when we talk about things like homosexuality or about economic competition and academic competition, we may become very discouraged. All right? Okay, so let me then turn to Asian Americans. And to just give you some basic background, as Asian Americans are a very diverse group. We're a category of all these different kinds of people. Chinese, Taiwanese, Filipino, Korean, Indian, Japanese, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Hmong, Hawaiian, Pacific, and others. Okay? And none of these groups of people really know each other. We're all living in our different world. In the Bay Area, of course, is kind of unique because we do have a chance to mix it up. Our children, when they go to school, will often meet people, other Asian Americans who are different from themselves, but they will. And so I just wanted to start with that when we use the word Asian American, we're not just talking about Taiwanese or Chinese. We're talking about all these groups. We're also talking about immigrant, second generation, and yes, there are some who are fifth generation Chinese Americans. Everyone together. Okay? Now just some data for you. In the 2010 U.S. Census, I'll correct that. The 2010 U.S. Census, those people who responded to the census, who called themselves Asians alone, numbered about almost 15 million, 14.67 million. And that's about 4.8% of the United States population. And if you include those who are children of mixed marriages, multiracial Asians, like white and black, white and Chinese and black and Filipino, something like that, then that increases it by another almost 3 million. So between 2000 to 2010, Asian Americans of all the groups have grown 46% in size of population. Okay, so we're now representing about 5.6 of the entire United States population. Still very small, but it's significant. Okay? Now, in the Bay Area, it doesn't feel like 5.6%, right? It feels like everyone you go to is Asian. And this is because in California, in the last 10 years, there are now 5.6 million Asians in California, which represents almost 15% of the population of California. Okay? And that's a 33.7% growth since 2000. So all of California has experienced where Asian Americans make up 15%. But if you just look at the Bay Area alone, Asian Americans represent 1/4 of the Bay Area population. Okay, so 1.7 million. If you want to, after I correct this, I'll send it to you so you can click the links and look it up yourself. So that's why in the Bay Area, there's so many of us. We're just all very smart. We decided to come to this beautiful place to live. We know better. so 1.7 million of us who live in the Bay Area, and even in the Bay Area, there's parts of the Bay Area that are much more Asian American, like Milpitas and Cupertino are now majority Asian cities. Okay, so if you go up to Sausalito or Tuburan, up in the north side, there are very few Asians there. But down here in San Francisco, there's a higher concentration. Okay, so knowing this, I want to pause and ask you, or maybe you can think about this. If our children grow up in this type of environment, okay, is this healthier? I'm not going to answer that. Just think about it. Because I grew up in a place where the Asian population was so tiny, so I did not have a very large Asian American community to be surrounded by. We came to the Bay Area because we wanted a place where our children could be more exposed to more Asian Americans as well as other cultures. My first teaching job was in Denver, and my second teaching job was in Rochester, New York. And in both of these cities, the Asian population is so tiny. And in fact, it was very lonely because there was a tiny Chinese church that we could go to. It was very small, but we could also never get good Chinese food, right? So we were very frustrated. So we decided that even though it's so expensive to live in California, when there was an opportunity to move out here, we wanted Nathaniel and Benji to be able to rub shoulders and interact with people other than white people. We wanted them to see other kinds of people too. So that's one of the main reasons we came out here. So if you're here, your children are growing up in a very, very, I would say this is a very ideal, blessed environment. So here's another map from the census about the concentration of Asian Americans, as you can see. Obviously, here in California, is a huge percentage. And up here in the New York City area, there's also a large chunk of Washington, D.C., Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, Chicago, Seattle. All the major cities are where the Asian Americans are concentrated. I know a lot of friends who grew up in the middle. I have some friends who grew up, see, here's Detroit, but some people grew up outside of Detroit. And because of that, their experience growing up was very different. So I hope you have a chance to talk to some of them. They can tell you a lot about the real America. Okay, and now I want to say a little bit more about one of the issues that Asian Americans have had to deal with. And this is a word that I want you to use, okay, because sometimes as new immigrants and you get treated a certain way, or people look at you a certain way, it's very hard to put a label to it because it still exists today. But the history of racial discrimination against Asian Americans is very strong, it's very deep. It's slowly changing, and here in the Bay Area is less than in Iowa. So it's better here because most of the white people here and the black people here and the Hispanic people here, they kind of understand who we are. And many of them also they like what we do. They like Gangnam style, they kind of enjoy our food, right? So in the Bay Area, most of the people are a little bit more understanding. But if you move to someplace else where they don't understand, it will be very different. And for those places where they have not gotten a chance to learn more about Asian Americans, this is more of a reality. So I'll just give you a little bit of background. Of course, you know that in 1882, there was a historic Chinese Exclusion Act where the immigration doors were closed to Chinese on the basis of race. Okay? And then this was renewed in 1892 and 1902, and not until 1943 did they open up the immigration to 105 a year. Okay, so America back then was very, 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 very racist. It was segregationist. You could not move in next door to a white person. You could not marry a white person. You could not get a job with a white person. You could not own property if you were not a citizen. You could not, and the list goes on and on and on. The discrimination was terrible. It was horrible. And many of the way that Americans think about Asians was born during this time. So some of the negative things that you hear and see is not because of today's reality, it's because this was passed on from generation to generation among white Americans. Okay? So when our children go to school, it's probably, these type of negative attitudes are probably less, but there are places in the Bay Area where a lot of white people still do not understand. Okay? And a lot of black people too. So, like where I grew up, where my children grew up in Castro Valley, it's a place where there's a lot of older white populations, and their children don't quite understand. Plus, all these Asians coming, they're scared of us. So some of the negative attitudes do still surface. Okay? And another example is the Japanese American internment camps. Are any of you familiar with this story? And some of you nod your head at, yeah. In 1941 to 46, when the United States was fighting against Japan, the American government had a policy of forcibly taking all the Japanese Americans out of their homes, mostly on the West Coast, and forcing them to move and relocate. So, you know, this woman here was absolutely happy about this. She was pointing to the signs on why you Japanese people get out of here. Okay? So they were almost 300,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast were forced to move into these places called internment camps. Paston, Gila, Manzanar is the nearest one. So if you go there today, you can see some of the historical remains. Topaz. So they are all forced to move out there. They lost a lot of property. Many white Christians were very helpful to actually protect the homes of many of the Japanese Americans, but on the other hand, many others would lost their property.